My son sent the email at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. He didn't know I could see it. He'd added me to a shared family calendar 2 years ago, something about keeping everyone coordinated for the holidays, and somewhere in the setup, his email notifications started mirroring to my tablet. I don't think he ever realized it. I didn't either. Not until that night in March when I was lying in bed reading and a preview notification lit up the screen. 2. Claire Harrington. Subject: RE, rehearsal dinner seating. About mom. I think we keep her at the far table with the cousins. She means well, but you know how she gets. Dad's family will be there, and I just can't have her saying the wrong thing in front of them. She doesn't understand these people, Claire. She never will. I read it 3 times. Then I set the tablet face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My son, Daniel, 34 years old. The boy I raised alone in a 2-bedroom house in Greenville, South Carolina, after his father left when he was 9. The boy I drove to every baseball practice, every science fair, every college visit. The boy whose application essays I proofread at midnight while working the early shift at the hospital the next morning. He didn't think I understood people. I got up, went to the kitchen, and made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. Through the window, the street was quiet. My neighbor's porch light was on. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, and nothing was. Let me back up, because the email wasn't where this story started. It wasn't even close. Daniel had been dating Claire Harrington for 2 years before he brought her home to meet me. That alone should have told me something. When I finally did meet her, we had dinner at a restaurant downtown. Her choice a place with a prix menu and no prices listed. Claire was beautiful in the careful way of women who've been told their whole lives that beauty is currency. She shook my hand instead of hugging me. Her mother, Patricia Harrington, had sent her regrets. She was at a charity function in Boston, couldn't make the trip. I remember thinking that was an odd reason to miss meeting your future daughter-in-law's boyfriend's mother. I filed it away and didn't think about it again. Over the next year, I noticed things. The way Daniel would go quiet on the phone when Claire walked into the room, the Christmas he called to say they were spending the holiday with the Harringtons in Newport. Their house was bigger, he said, easier to host. The way he started describing me to people as, my mom, she was in healthcare administration, when really I had spent 26 years as a licensed practical nurse on the pediatric floor at Greenville Memorial. Not administration. Nursing. Bedside nursing. There's a difference, and he knew it. I told myself he was just nervous about impressing Claire's family. The Harringtons were old Boston money. Shipping, real estate, some kind of endowment at a university I couldn't remember. Patricia Harrington sat on 3 nonprofit boards and had a hyphenated name she'd kept from a first marriage. Her husband, Edward, had been profiled in a regional business magazine. They were the kind of family that made other people feel like they needed to straighten their posture. I understood that feeling. I'd felt it the one time I met Patricia at a birthday dinner for Daniel in Charleston the previous fall. She'd asked me what I did, and when I said I was a retired nurse, she'd smiled the way people smile when they're trying not to say anything. Then she'd turned to Daniel and asked about his portfolio allocation for the next quarter. I'd eaten my salmon and watched my son laugh at something Edward said, and I'd thought, he's trying so hard. He's always been trying so hard. But the email was different. The email wasn't nervousness or social awkwardness, it was a decision. A deliberate, calculated decision to manage me, to put me somewhere out of the way at a table with cousins who wouldn't notice, so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of people he was trying to impress. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my friend Ruth, who has known me since Daniel was in diapers and who has never once told me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to. He put you at a table with the cousins, she repeated back to me. Far table. Away from the Harringtons. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Sandra, what are you going to do? I hadn't decided yet. That was the honest answer. Part of me wanted to call Daniel immediately, to confront him, to ask him directly what exactly he thought I was going to say to his father-in-law's people that would be so catastrophically embarrassing. But another part of me, the part that had spent 34 years loving this boy, wanted to wait. Wanted to be sure I understood the full picture before I did anything I couldn't take back. "Nothing yet," I said. "I'm gonna wait." What I didn't tell Ruth was that I'd already done something early that morning before the sun came up. I'd gone to the small filing cabinet in my home office, the one with the green hanging folders I'd organized and never looked at, and pulled out a manila envelope I'd received 6 months earlier and set aside without opening properly. It had come from a law office in Columbia. I'd assumed it was something routine, something left over from my ex-husband Gerald's estate, which had been settled years ago. Gerald had died 4 years back, a heart attack, quick. We hadn't spoken in years, but I'd been notified as a formality. I'd glanced at the envelope when it arrived, seen the words Cole Family Holdings LLC in the return address, and put it in the filing cabinet thinking I'd deal with it later. Later had become 6 months. I opened it that morning. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Robert Whitfield, along with a 14-page document I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. When Gerald and I divorced, the settlement had included, buried in paragraph 9 of the original agreement, written in language I hadn't fully understood at the time, a 17% minority stake in Cole Family Holdings, a small holding company Gerald had started with his brother in the 90s. The stake had been assigned to me as part of the asset division. My attorney at the time had told me it was probably worth a few $1,000s. The company did light commercial construction, nothing glamorous. The letter from Robert Whitfield was informing me that Cole Family Holdings had recently entered into a joint venture agreement, pending final signatures, with Harrington Development Partners. Harrington, as in Edward Harrington, as in Claire's father, as in the man my son was so desperate to impress that he'd written an email putting his own mother at the far table with the cousins. I sat at my kitchen table in Greenville, South Carolina, in my bathrobe with cold coffee, holding a document that told me I owned 17% of a company that Edward Harrington needed to complete a $30 million mixed-use development project in Columbia. The deal required unanimous consent from all equity holders. Gerald's brother Wayne held the majority, but my 17% was a blocking stake. Without my signature, the deal couldn't close. I read the letter from Robert Whitfield again. He'd been trying to reach me for 6 months. He'd sent the envelope, called the number on file, my old landline which I'd disconnected, and eventually sent a second letter to my current address, which I apparently had also not opened properly. He was asking me to contact his office at my earliest convenience to discuss my options regarding the pending transaction. I looked at the phone number at the bottom of the letter. It was 6014 in the morning. I waited until 9 and called. Robert Whitfield answered himself, which surprised me. He sounded like a man in his 60s, measured and careful with his words. He explained the situation clearly. Cole Family Holdings had been in negotiations with Harrington Development for 8 months. The joint venture was structured around a historic mill property in Columbia that Harrington wanted to convert into mixed-income housing, a significant project, significant financing, significant reputation on the line for both parties. Gerald's brother Wayne had agreed to the terms, but the operating agreement required all equity holders to sign off on major transactions. And my 17% counts as a blocking stake, I said. Yes, ma'am. Without your signature on the consent form, the deal cannot proceed. Wayne Cole has been trying to locate you for some time. I thought about that for a moment. Wayne. I hadn't spoken to Wayne since Gerald's funeral. He and Gerald had never included me in anything related to the business. I hadn't even known the company still existed until this letter arrived. What happens if I don't sign? I asked. There was a brief pause. The transaction would not close. Harrington Development would need to find an alternative equity partner or restructure the deal entirely. Given the timeline and financing already in place, that would be complex. How complex? How complex? They have a construction loan commitment that expires in 90 days. If the joint venture isn't executed before then, the lender withdraws. Harrington would lose their preferred financing and likely the project. I thanked Robert Whitfield, told him I'd be in touch, and hung up. Then I sat very still and thought about my son's email. She doesn't understand these people, Claire. She never will. The rehearsal dinner was in 3 weeks. The wedding was 4 days after that. I had 90 days before a construction loan expired, but I had 3 weeks before my son stood in a room full of people who mattered to him and made me invisible. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't respond to the email he'd sent Claire. What I did instead was call Robert Whitfield back the following Monday and schedule a meeting at his office in Columbia. I drove the 90 minutes myself on a Wednesday morning, listened to the radio the whole way, stopped for coffee at a gas station outside of Lexington. Robert Whitfield's office was in a converted Victorian building downtown, the kind of place that felt serious without being intimidating. He was exactly what he'd sounded like on the phone: methodical, honest, no performance about it. He walked me through the entire structure of Cole Family Holdings, the history of my stake, what signing would mean and what not signing would mean. He was careful never to tell me what to do. He just laid it all out. "There's one more thing," he said near the end of the meeting. He slid a single page across the desk. "Wayne Cole requested that I show you this." It was an internal memo from Harrington Development to their attorney, copied to Wayne. In it, Edward Harrington's team expressed concern about the outstanding minority holder and recommended that Wayne resolve the consent issue through family channels before the matter became a complication. Family channels. I was a complication to be resolved through family channels. I handed the page back to Robert without saying anything. On the drive home, I stopped at a rest area outside of Case and sat in my car for 20 minutes watching a family eat sandwiches at a picnic table. A little girl kept dropping her juice box. Her mother kept picking it up. I thought about Daniel at 9 years old, the year Gerald left. How he'd crawled into my bed the first night and asked if it was his fault. How I'd held him and told him no, absolutely not. Nothing about this is your fault. You are the most important person in my world. How I'd meant every word of it. I thought about the pediatric ward at Greenville Memorial, the kids I'd taken care of for 26 years, the ones whose parents couldn't afford to stay, who needed a nurse to sit with them through the night. I'd done that. Not administration, sitting with children through the night. I thought about my son writing that email. I started the car and drove home. 2 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, Daniel called to go over logistics. His voice had that careful brightness people use when they're managing someone. "We're so excited you're coming, Mom. It's going to be a beautiful weekend." "I'm looking forward to it," I said. "So you'll be at the rehearsal Friday night and then the ceremony Saturday afternoon?" "Daniel," I said, "where am I sitting at the rehearsal dinner?" A pause. "Small, but there. We've got you at a great table. You'll love the cousins." "Which cousins?" "Kyle and Beth, and Aunt Donna's kids. And the Harringtons will be at which table?" Longer pause. "Mom, it's just how the seating worked out. Claire's mom is very particular about the arrangement." "I'm sure she is," I said. "I'll see you Friday." I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were steady. I noticed that. In my experience, when you've already made a decision, your hands stop shaking. It's the deciding that makes them shake. I called Robert Whitfield the next morning. I told him I was ready to discuss my options and I wanted to understand exactly what conditions I could attach to my consent. He was quiet for a moment. "You can attach reasonable conditions to your execution of the consent form, yes? This is a negotiated transaction." "What would count as reasonable?" "Financial terms, assurances about the project's community impact commitments, standard protective provisions for a minority holder." He paused. "Is there something specific you have in mind?" "Not financial," I said. "Let me think about it." I thought about it for 3 days. I walked in the evenings, something I'd started doing after retirement, just around the neighborhood as the light changed. I thought about what I actually wanted, not what would hurt Daniel, not what would embarrass the Harringtons, what I wanted. What I wanted was simple, and it had nothing to do with the deal. I wanted my son to see me, not manage me, not file me away at a far table. See me. On the Wednesday before the rehearsal dinner, I drove back to Columbia. Robert Whitfield had arranged for Wayne Cole to be there as well. Wayne was 71, heavier than I remembered, and visibly uncomfortable. He brought his own attorney. I told them my terms. I would sign the consent form. I would cooperate fully with closing the joint venture. But I had one condition, and it was non-negotiable before I signed. Daniel had to sit with me. Just the two of us. No Claire, no Harringtons, no attorneys, and have an honest conversation. Not an apology necessarily, just a conversation. One where he told me the truth about what he'd been doing and why. Wayne's attorneys started to object. I held up one hand. The construction loan expires in 90 days, I said. I have 90 days to make this decision. This is my condition. It's not financial. It won't cost anyone money. It will cost my son 45 minutes. Robert Whitfield said nothing. Wayne looked at the table. That's all, I said. You let Daniel know the situation. The rest is up to him. I signed nothing that day. I drove home, stopped at the same gas station in Lexington for coffee, and arrived back in Greenville as the sun was setting. My phone rang 3 hours later. Daniel, Mom. His voice was different. The managed brightness was gone. Wayne called me. I know. He said you won't sign unless we talk. Yes. Silence. I could hear him breathing. In the background, something, a television or Claire in another room. Mom, the deal. I know about the deal, Daniel. I know for 2 weeks. Another silence. Why didn't you say anything? Because I was waiting to see what you'd do. When you called to go over logistics and put me at the cousins' table, I had my answer. Mom, Friday, I said, before the rehearsal dinner. You and me. There's a diner on Main Street in Greenville. Pauline's, we used to go there when you were little. I'll be there at noon. He came. He drove up from Charleston the morning of the rehearsal dinner, arrived at Pauline's at 12:02, and sat down across from me in a booth by the window. He'd grown into a man who looked like Gerald in the jaw and like me around the eyes. I'd forgotten that somehow, that he had my eyes. We ordered coffee. Neither of us looked at the menu. How did you find out about the stake? He asked. A letter from Robert Whitfield. 6 months ago. I didn't open it right away. I didn't know you had a stake. I swear, Mom, I didn't know. I believed him. That was almost worse, that he'd written that email without any idea that I held something the Harringtons needed. He'd been managing me for nothing, for the pure instinct of it. Tell me what you were afraid I'd do, I said. At the rehearsal dinner. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Say the wrong thing. What's the wrong thing? He looked out the window. On Main Street, a woman was loading groceries into a car. A man was walking a dog that kept stopping to smell everything. Tell a story about the hospital, he said finally. Talk about money. Ask Claire's dad the wrong question. I don't know. Just not fit. Not fit in with the Harringtons. They're not bad people, Mom. They're just particular, I said. He flinched slightly. Yeah, Daniel. I waited until he looked at me. I was a nurse for 26 years. I worked nights so you could go to summer camp. I drove a car with a broken heater for 2 years because we needed the money for your braces. I have never once in your entire life done anything that should make you ashamed of me. His jaw tightened. I know that. Do you? Because that email suggested otherwise. He was quiet for a long time. The coffee sat between us, cooling. I'm terrified, he said finally. That's the honest answer. I'm terrified I'm going to lose her. That they're going to decide I'm not. He stopped. Enough, I said. You're afraid you're not enough for them. He nodded. Just once. Something in his face cracked open a little when he did it, the way faces do when people say the true thing out loud for the first time. Daniel, I said quietly, I raised you by myself in a 2-bedroom house on a nurse's salary. We were not wealthy. We were not connected. I never once let you believe that made you worth less than anyone else. Where did you learn this? He didn't have an answer. I hadn't really expected one. I'm going to sign the paperwork, I said. Not because of the deal, not because Wayne needs it, not to do anyone any favors. I'm going to sign it because I decided to, and because it's the right thing to do for a housing project that will help people who need it. But I need you to understand something first. He looked at me. This is the only conversation like this we're ever going to have. I will not spend the rest of my life being managed by you. I will not sit at the cousin's table. I will not pretend to be something other than what I am, and I will not let you pretend either. If you want me in your life, as your mother, as a grandmother someday, as anything, it will be as I am. All of it. Mom, I'm not finished. I love you. I have loved you every single day since before you were born. That love is not contingent on anything, but I am done making myself small so you can feel more comfortable. I worked too hard and lived too honestly to disappear into a corner because your future in-laws have a hyphenated name and a summer house. Daniel pressed his fingers to his eyes. His shoulders shook once. Then he took a breath and lowered his hands and looked at me, and he had the eyes he'd had at 9 years old when he'd climbed into my bed and asked if it was his fault. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. It was quiet and undecorated and real. I'm so sorry. We sat there for a while. Pauline's was filling up around us. The lunch crowd, people who didn't know us and didn't need to. A waitress refilled our coffee without being asked. Outside, the woman with the groceries drove away. Move me to a different table, I said. I don't care where. I just want to be where I can see you. I'll fix the seating today, he said. Claire will understand. I hope that was true. I didn't know Claire well enough to know what she'd understand and what she wouldn't. But that was going to be Daniel's work, not mine. I signed Robert Whitfield's paperwork that afternoon from my car with forms he'd emailed over that morning. I forwarded the executed documents from the parking lot of Pauline's Diner, watched the confirmation screen light up on my phone, and then I drove home to get dressed for the rehearsal dinner. I wore a dress I'd bought 6 months earlier and never had an occasion for. Deep blue, symbol cut, the kind of thing that says I know exactly who I am. My friend Ruth had sent it to me as a birthday gift with a note that said, "Stop saving things for later." I thought she was just being Ruth. Turns out she'd been right. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant on the waterfront in Charleston. I drove myself. When I walked in, Daniel was standing near the entrance, and when he saw me, he came over immediately. Not to manage me, but just to be there, and he put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Mom, you look beautiful." I was seated 2 tables from the Harringtons, near enough to be present, far enough that nobody was anxious about it. Patricia Harrington caught my eye once across the room and gave me a nod that I chose to interpret generously. Edward Harrington came to find me after dinner, while people were having dessert. He was taller than I remembered, deliberate in his movements, a man who was used to being the most prepared person in the room. "Mrs. Cole," he said, and extended his hand. "I understand we owe you some thanks." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "It was the right thing to do for the project." He looked at me for a moment with what might have been genuine reassessment. "Robert Whitfield says you asked for nothing in return, no financial consideration." "That's correct." "Why?" I picked up my coffee cup. "Because what I needed wasn't financial." He nodded slowly. He seemed like a man who understood that, even if he couldn't quite place it in a category. "The Columbia project will bring about 400 units of mixed-income housing to a neighborhood that's needed it for a decade," he said. "Your stake will be worth considerably more after this closes, for what it's worth." "I appreciate you telling me," I said, and I meant it. He went back to his table. I finished my coffee and watched my son across the room talking to Claire's younger brother, laughing at something. He looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, like a man who'd set something down. The wedding was on a Saturday in April, outdoors at a historic property outside of Charleston, the kind of venue with live oaks and a view of the marsh. I sat in the third row. I could see Daniel's face when Claire came down the aisle, and it was the face of a man who loved someone completely. Whatever else was complicated about all of this, that was real, and I was glad of it. At the reception, I sat at a table with Daniel's college roommate and his wife, and Claire's cousin, who turned out to be a pediatric occupational therapist. And we talked for 2 hours about the state of children's health care in the Southeast, and I forgot, briefly, that I'd been dreading this day at all. Patricia Harrington found me near the end of the evening, while the dancing was still going. She was holding a glass of champagne and looked like someone who had decided in advance to be gracious. "Daniel tells me you were a nurse," she said. 26 years. Pediatrics. That's a hard specialty. It has hard days, I said. It also has the best days of anywhere I've ever been. She considered that. Then she said, "My sister was a labor and delivery nurse for 30 years. Best person I know." There was something almost shy in the way she said it, which I hadn't expected. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," I said. Patricia looked at her champagne. "I haven't always made people feel that way." "Worth knowing." She said it simply, without drama, the way people say things they've been sitting with for a while. "It's not too late to change that," I said. She looked at me. Then she nodded once and moved on. I didn't know what to do with Patricia Harrington. I wasn't sure I needed to do anything. She was going to be part of the family now, and families are long projects. Things shift. I've lived long enough to know that. On the drive home that night, I'd gotten the room in Charleston and was heading back the next morning, but I went for a drive first, along the waterfront, the way I always do in a city when I need to process something. I thought about what I'd actually won and lost in the past 3 weeks. I hadn't publicly humiliated anyone. There'd been no dramatic confrontation, no documents delivered at a cocktail hour, no room gone silent. What there'd been was a Tuesday morning in a diner booth, 2 cups of cooling coffee, and my son saying I'm sorry like he meant it. Maybe that was quieter than some people would have wanted. Maybe it wouldn't make for the kind of story that ends with a room stunned into silence. But I've worked a pediatric floor for 26 years. I've learned that the most important things mostly happen quietly in small rooms with low voices. When I got home Sunday afternoon, there was a voicemail from Robert Whitfield saying the joint venture had formally closed. There was also a text from Daniel with a photo from the wedding, the two of us, taken by someone I didn't see, in the moment after he'd walked over to me at the entrance and put his arm around my shoulder. I was looking at the camera. He was looking at me. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while in my quiet house. The late afternoon light came through the window over the sink, the way it always does at this hour, landing on the same spot on the floor it's been landing on for 11 years. I thought about the filing cabinet in my office, the green hanging folders, the envelope I'd set aside for 6 months without opening. I thought about all the things we file away thinking we'll deal with later, and how sometimes later comes whether you're ready or not. I made tea, this time the kind I actually drank, sat at the kitchen table, pulled out the yellow legal pad I keep for lists, and wrote at the top, "Things I am not going to do anymore." I wrote for a while. It was a long list. Then I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Things I am going to do instead." That list was shorter, but it was a start. And in my experience, a start is really all you need. The rest comes if you keep showing up. I kept showing up. I always have. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I've been thinking about what it actually costs a person to make themselves invisible. Not the dramatic cost, not the one you feel all at once. The slow kind. The kind that adds up in small increments over years until one day you're lying in bed reading and a notification lights up your screen and you realize you've been disappearing so gradually you almost didn't notice. Daniel didn't set out to hurt me. I believe that now in a way I couldn't have believed it the night I read his email. He set out to protect himself, which is a very human thing to do. He built something he was afraid of losing, and he decided, without ever quite saying it out loud, that the safest way to protect it was to manage me. File me away somewhere I couldn't cause complications. What he didn't understand, and what took me a long time to understand myself, is that when you make that decision about someone who loves you, you're not protecting anything. You're just postponing the reckoning. I spent 26 years as a nurse. I watched people avoid hard conversations at bedsides, in waiting rooms, in the hallways outside rooms where someone was dying. I watched families hold on to silence like it was something precious, like if they just didn't say the thing out loud, it might not be true. And I watched over and over how the silence always cost more than the conversation would have. I think about that now when I think about what I almost didn't do. I almost filed Robert Whitfield's letter back into the green hanging folder and dealt with it later. I almost let Daniel seat me at the cousins' table and told myself it was fine. I almost kept being the kind of woman who smiles and adjusts and asks nothing for herself because asking feels like too much trouble. The thing about that kind of patience, the kind that looks like grace but is really just avoidance, is that it doesn't protect anyone. It just teaches the people around you that your boundaries are negotiable, that you can be moved, that you'll absorb whatever's handed to you and keep going without complaint, so they never have to change. What changed for me wasn't the money. It wasn't the leverage. It was the moment I read that email and felt, underneath the hurt, something else entirely. Something quiet and certain that said, no, not this time. I am not going to disappear into this corner and pretend it's fine. That's the thing nobody tells you about self-respect. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It shows up at 6 in the morning in your bathrobe with cold coffee, and it looks a lot like just deciding. Just deciding you're done making yourself small. Just deciding that the people who love you should have to show up for all of you, not just the parts that are convenient. Daniel sat across from me at Pauline's and said, I'm sorry, and I believed him, but the apology wasn't really the point. The point was the conversation itself. Two people telling the truth to each other in a diner booth instead of managing each other from a distance. That's what I'd wanted all along. Not power, not leverage, just honesty. Families are long projects. I know that. Patricia Harrington and I are not going to be close friends. Daniel and I are still rebuilding something that got quietly damaged over years, and that takes time. But we're doing it honestly now, and that matters more than I can say. I kept showing up, even when it cost me, even when it would have been easier to stay small. That's the whole story, really. The rest is just details.